why a nation wasn't a nation until centuries later, long before Germany existed as a nation in the modern sense. The lands that would one day become Germany were a patchwork of rival territories, tribal loyalties, and competing rulers. There was no single capital, no unified crown, no one flag. Instead, medieval Germany was a world of fragmented power, a land where kings ruled but never completely, where dukes obeyed, but only when it suited them, where bishops held armies, nobles fought private wars, and cities built their own influence. To understand why Germany remained divided for centuries, we must go back to the collapse of one of Europe's greatest empires, the Empire of Charlemagne. When Charlemagne died in 814, his empire stretched across much of Western and Central Europe. It was one of the largest political entities the continent had seen since Rome. But empires built by conquest often struggle to survive succession, and this one was no exception. After the death of his son, Louis the Pious, the empire was divided among heirs through the Treaty of Verdun in 843. This division was more than a dynastic arrangement. It was the beginning of a political identity crisis. East Francia was not yet Germany. It was a kingdom made up of different peoples, languages, and regional identities. Saxons, Bavarians, Franks, Swabians, Lotharingians. Each region possessed its own traditions, aristocracy, and power structure. These were not provinces in the modern sense. They were power centers, each with its own noble elite, each with its own ambitions, and most importantly, each with its own sense of self. Over time, these regions evolved into what historians call the stem duchies: Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, and Lotharingia. These duchies became the structural foundation of medieval German fragmentation. Unlike a centralized kingdom such as later France or England, East Francia developed as a negotiated realm. Kings depended on powerful dukes, dukes depended on regional nobles, and nobles depended on local alliances. Power flowed outward rather than downward. This is what made unification so difficult. The king could not simply command the entire realm as a modern monarch might. He had to persuade, negotiate, reward, threaten, and often compromise. When the last Carolingian ruler of East Francia died in 911 without an heir, something historically important happened. Instead of automatically passing the throne by bloodline, the nobles elected a king. Conrad of Franconia was chosen. This decision changed the political DNA of the region. It established a tradition that power came not solely from inheritance, but from aristocratic consent. This would later become one of the defining features of the Holy Roman Empire. And it also planted the seeds of long-term division. Because elected kings are never fully independent, they owe their position to those who raised them. That means the princes, dukes, and bishops who supported the king always expected influence in return. This balance of power prevented any ruler from easily centralizing authority. When Henry the Fowler of Saxony became king in 919, he faced a kingdom that was technically united but practically fragmented. The duchies remained highly autonomous. Saxony had its own internal nobility. Bavaria acted with significant independence. Franconia and Swabia maintained their own regional political structures. Henry's achievement was not the creation of a nation. It was the preservation of a fragile coalition. He ruled through diplomacy and personal authority, not absolute control. This difference is crucial. In France, the monarchy slowly worked to weaken local nobles over time. In the German lands, the opposite often happened. The regional rulers remained strong, sometimes stronger than the king himself. This meant that what later became Germany entered the Middle Ages, not as a nation in formation, but as a federation of rival powers. By the time Otto I was crowned emperor in 962, the political structure became even more complex. This marked the beginning of what later historians called the Holy Roman Empire. The title sounded grand, imperial, unified, powerful, but the reality was different. The empire was less a nation and more a political network. A loose confederation of duchies, bishoprics, counties, marches, and free cities. Even the emperor's authority depended heavily on regional support. This system created constant tension. Because every ruler below the emperor had incentives to preserve local autonomy, a duke in Bavaria did not necessarily want a stronger emperor in Saxony. A bishop in Mainz did not want secular princes controlling church lands. A count on the Rhine might ally with one duke against another. This was a world of overlapping loyalties. Dynastic rivalries intensified the problem. The great ducal families competed constantly for prestige, territory, and influence. Saxony and Bavaria frequently emerged as major power blocks. Franconia and Swabia carried their own dynastic ambitions. Marriage alliances reshaped borders. Inheritance disputes caused wars. Feudal obligations created chains of loyalty that often conflicted with royal authority. In short, medieval Germany became politically fragmented because its institutions rewarded decentralization. Every local ruler benefited from preserving autonomy. Every emperor faced resistance when trying to consolidate power. And unlike island kingdoms such as England, geography also worked against centralization. The German lands sat at the crossroads of Europe. Open frontiers meant exposure to Slavic territories in the east, France in the west, Italy in the south, and Scandinavian pressures in the north. This constant external pressure often forced rulers to rely even more on local military elites, and every time a local lord raised troops for defense, his own regional authority increased. Feudalism deepened this pattern. Land was the source of power. Control over land meant control over taxation, soldiers, and justice. Kings granted lands to nobles in exchange for loyalty. But once granted, these lands often became hereditary. This strengthened local dynasties over generations. Instead of building one kingdom, the system multiplied centers of power. One castle became a county, one county became a duchy, one duchy became a semi-independent political force. Over centuries, this process created a landscape of deeply rooted territorial identities. People often identified first with Saxony or Bavaria, rather than with any concept of Germany. This cultural fragmentation reinforced political division. Language differences added another layer. Old High German dialects varied significantly by region. Legal traditions differed. Customs differed. Even economic networks were regional. Northern territories looked toward Baltic trade. Southern regions connected to Italy and Alpine routes. The Rhineland developed its own urban commercial culture. This made the idea of a unified German identity extremely weak during the Middle Ages. Germany was a civilization space, not yet a nation. That is the core reason behind its fragmentation. The Middle Ages did not create Germany. They created the conditions that delayed its birth. It became embedded in the very institutions that governed the land. At the center of this system stood the Holy Roman Emperor. In theory, he was one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. He carried the legacy of Rome. He claimed imperial authority. He stood as the protector of Christendom. But in reality, the emperor's power was never absolute. Unlike the kings of England or France, the German emperor did not inherit an unquestioned throne. He had to be accepted, supported, and often negotiated into power. This was one of the greatest structural reasons behind Germany's long political fragmentation. Because a ruler who depends on powerful nobles to gain authority can never fully dominate them. Every emperor began his rule already indebted to princes, dukes, bishops, and regional lords. This turned the empire into a balance of power rather than a unified state. The emperor sat at the top, but the foundation beneath him was unstable. One of the most important turning points came with the rise of the imperial princes. These were not ordinary nobles. They were territorial rulers with their own armies, taxation systems, courts, and political ambitions. Some were secular princes. Others were church leaders, archbishops, bishops, abbeys, church-controlled territories. This is what made the German lands uniquely complex. Religion and politics were deeply intertwined. A bishop was not merely a spiritual leader. He could also be a landowner, a military commander, and a political decision-maker. This created an entirely separate layer of power inside the empire. Instead of one crown controlling the realm, authority was shared among dozens of semi-independent rulers, and each of them had reasons to resist centralization. The emperor often relied on bishops because church officials, unlike hereditary dukes, theoretically had no legitimate heirs. This meant church lands could remain more directly connected to imperial influence. For a time, this helped emperors counterbalance powerful noble families. But this strategy carried a dangerous consequence. It brought emperors into direct conflict with the papacy. This tension exploded during one of medieval Europe's most important struggles, the investiture controversy. This conflict was not just about religion. It was about who had the right to appoint bishops and church officials. The emperor claimed this authority. The pope rejected it, because whoever appointed bishops effectively controlled major territories within the empire. When Emperor Henry IV clashed with Pope Gregory VII, the conflict became a political earthquake. The pope excommunicated the emperor. This was devastating. In medieval Europe, excommunication was not merely symbolic. It undermined legitimacy, it weakened loyalty, and most dangerously, it gave princes an excuse to challenge imperial authority. If the emperor stood in conflict with the church, regional rulers could claim moral justification for resistance. This accelerated fragmentation. Princes gained leverage. The emperor lost centralized control. Even after Henry IV's dramatic journey to Canossa in 1077, where he sought forgiveness from the pope, The deeper damage had already been done. The empire had become more divided than before. The struggle between crown and church opened space for regional powers to grow stronger. And they used it. Dukes expanded their territorial claims. Bishops strengthened their local authority. Counts fortified castles and increased taxation rights. Cities negotiated privileges directly from emperors and princes alike. The result was a constantly shifting mosaic of power. No single authority could dominate for long. Another major factor behind fragmentation was the elective nature of imperial succession. Unlike hereditary monarchies, the emperor was chosen by leading princes. Over time, this evolved into the formal system of prince-electors. This meant every succession crisis became a political negotiation. Candidates had to offer privileges, land grants, tax exemptions, titles, rights, in order to secure support. Every election strengthened the princes, because each emperor needed them more than they needed him. This reversed the normal logic of monarchy. Instead of the crown controlling the nobility increasingly controlled the crown. By the time the Holy Roman Empire entered its mature medieval phase, fragmentation was no longer simply a political condition. It had become a way of life. The German lands were now defined by rival dynasties, feudal competition, and territorial ambition. Every region had its own power centers. Every noble house sought expansion. Every ruler feared being overshadowed by another. This was not a nation moving toward unity. It was a landscape constantly pulling itself apart. At the heart of this struggle stood the great dynastic families. These families did not merely hold titles, they controlled armies, fortresses, trade routes, marriage alliances, and claims to succession. Among the most powerful were the Welfs and the Hohenstaufens. Their rivalry shaped much of medieval German politics. This was more than personal competition. It was a struggle over the direction of the empire itself. Who should dominate the imperial throne? Which region should lead? Whose bloodline would shape the future? These questions fueled decades of instability. When one dynasty rose, others immediately sought alliances to counterbalance it. A duke in Saxony might support one claimant, its own taxation systems, its own alliances, and often its own military forces. This made unified governance nearly impossible. The emperor might claim authority over all, but in practice, local rulers exercised power on the ground. Feudal warfare became another major force behind fragmentation. Disputes over succession, inheritance, borders, and trade routes frequently erupted into armed conflict. These were not always large imperial wars. Many were regional, localized, private, yet their impact was enormous. A conflict between two noble houses could destabilize an entire region. Castles were besieged, villages burned, trade roads disrupted, peasant populations displaced. This constant low-level warfare reinforced territorial identities. People depended on their local rulers for protection. This strengthened loyalty to regional powers rather than any larger imperial structure. Rivalry between Saxony and Bavaria remained especially significant. These were not merely territories. They were political identities with deep aristocratic traditions. Their rulers sought prestige and influence over imperial decisions. At times, these duchies acted almost like separate states. Their ambitions often clashed with imperial authority. If an emperor came from one region, rival regions often resisted him. This further prevented centralization. Swabia and Franconia developed their own competing aristocratic networks. The Rhineland emerged as an economically powerful zone shaped by river trade and urban wealth. Northern territories looked increasingly toward Baltic commerce. This economic diversity also encouraged fragmentation. Different regions developed different priorities. A merchant city focused on trade, a frontier duchy focused on defense, a church territory focused on ecclesiastical influence. There was no single national interest, only overlapping regional interests. Marriage politics added yet another layer. Dynastic marriages were often used to secure alliances or territorial claims, but these arrangements frequently created new disputes. If a noble house married into another territory, inheritance rights could overlap. By the end of the medieval period, the lands that would one day become Germany had already spent centuries divided. Kings had risen, dynasties had fought, princes had expanded their power, cities had grown rich, church territories had become states of their own. And yet, despite all of this political life, no unified German nation had emerged. This is what makes the story of Germany's fragmentation so unique, unlike France or England, where the Middle Ages gradually strengthened the monarchy and pushed power toward central rule. The German lands moved in the opposite direction. Every century deepened regional authority. Every political crisis strengthened local rulers. Every imperial compromise preserved fragmentation. What had begun as a loose coalition after the collapse of the Carolingian world had now become a permanent structure. The Holy Roman Empire survived, but it survived as a political framework, not as a nation-state. This distinction is critical. An empire can exist without national unity, and that is exactly what happened here. The emperor remained the symbolic head of the German world, but symbols do not always create control. Real authority remained dispersed. Princes ruled their territories with remarkable independence. They collected taxes, raised armies, administered justice, negotiated marriages and alliances, and often made decisions without waiting for imperial approval. This meant that the empire functioned more like a federation of states than a centralized kingdom. Over time, this fragmentation became self-sustaining, because every territorial ruler now had a vested interest in preserving it. A duke in Bavaria had no desire to lose his autonomy to a distant emperor. A bishop in Cologne did not want church lands absorbed into secular administration. A merchant city such as Lübeck valued its own legal privileges and trade independence. Unity threatened power. Division protected it. This is why unification remained so distant. The system rewarded local sovereignty. Another important reason lies in geography. The German lands sat at the heart of Europe. Unlike island kingdoms protected by natural barriers, this region was open on multiple fronts. To the west lay France. To the east, Slavic lands and later expanding eastern principalities. To the south, the Alpine world and Italian politics. To the north, Baltic trade zones and Scandinavian influence. This exposed geography encouraged regional military organization. Frontier lords became powerful because they were responsible for local defense. Marches and border territories developed their own strategic identities. Over time, military necessity reinforced political decentralization. Each region learned to defend itself, and in doing so, it strengthened its own independence. Economic development also pulled the German lands in different directions. Northern regions looked toward the Baltic and North Sea trade routes. The Hanseatic cities became commercially powerful and increasingly urban in character. Their interests centered on shipping, commerce, and mercantile law. Southern regions, by contrast, were deeply tied to Alpine routes, Italian exchange, and inland aristocratic politics. The Rhineland developed around river commerce and urban wealth. Eastern territories focused on colonization, frontier expansion, and agrarian development. These economic differences made national unity even harder. Different regions had different priorities, different sources of wealth, different strategic concerns. There was no single economic engine pulling the whole region toward one centralized state. Instead, there were many competing centers. Culture deepened this divide. Language remained highly regional. Dialect differences were significant enough to shape identity. Law codes varied from territory to territory. Customs differed. Inheritance rules differed. Religious institutions differed in influence. Even architecture and urban life reflected regional traditions. A noble in Swabia, a merchant in Hamburg, and a bishop in Mainz lived within the same imperial framework but experienced vastly different political realities. This reinforced the idea that identity was local first. People saw themselves through region, duchy, city, or lordship. The concept of Germany as one nation remained abstract. The emperor himself often had broader ambitions that distracted from internal unity. Holy Roman emperors were deeply involved in Italian affairs. Many campaigns and political struggles centered on northern Italy, papal relations, and imperial prestige beyond the German lands. This diverted energy away from internal consolidation. Instead of building a centralized German kingdom, emperors frequently pursued wider imperial goals. Prestige abroad often came at the cost of cohesion at home. Meanwhile, the princes used every absence, every imperial conflict, and every succession crisis to strengthen themselves further. This became especially visible in later centuries. The Golden Bull of 1356 formalized the role of prince-electors. This was politically important. It brought clarity to imperial succession, but it also institutionalized fragmentation, because it legally strengthened the autonomy and prestige of the leading territorial princes. The emperor was now even more dependent on elite regional powers. This made centralization harder than ever. By now, fragmentation was no longer accidental. It was constitutional. It was part of the empire's political design. The Holy Roman Empire endured not by eliminating division, but by organizing it. That is why Germany remained politically divided far beyond the Middle Ages. The structures created in this era shaped the next several centuries. The Reformation would later intensify regional division. Religious conflict would strengthen territorial sovereignty even further. The 30 Years' War would devastate Central Europe and leave the German lands. Even more politically fractured. By the early modern period, hundreds of states, principalities, bishoprics, duchies, and cities still existed, some large and influential, others so small they covered little more than a few towns. And yet each remained politically distinct. This long medieval legacy explains why German national unification came so late. While France and England consolidated power much earlier, the German world remained a political mosaic. It would not become a unified nation-state until the 19th century, centuries after the medieval structures had first taken shape. That is the true historical impact of fragmentation. The Middle Ages did not simply divide Germany. They created a political culture in which division became normal, legitimate, even desirable for those who held local power. And this legacy shaped Europe itself. A fragmented German center meant shifting balances of power across the continent. French expansion, Italian imperial struggles, Eastern frontier politics, religious conflict. All were influenced by the fact that Germany was not one nation, but many territories. So when we ask why Germany was not a nation for centuries, the answer is not one event. It is a long chain of causes: feudal institutions, elective monarchy, church politics, dynastic rivalry, regional identity, economic diversity, geography, and above all, a political system that rewarded autonomy over unity. Germany was not born late as a nation because history forgot it. It was because the Middle Ages built a world where fragmentation was stronger than centralization. Only centuries later would that begin to change. And when it finally did, the legacy of medieval division would still shape the modern nation that emerged. That is why the story of fragmented Germany is not only a medieval story, it is the foundation of modern German history.